the independent clause versus the dependent clause. What's the difference? How can we tell the difference? And which one is more important in a sentence? We're going to learn all about that right now. First of all, let's take a look at what the independent clause is. The independent clause contains at least a subject and a verb. Very good. It's also a complete thought. And a complete thought, and it contains a subject and a verb, can also be known as a simple sentence if it's just one independent clause. Furthermore, we can simply say, hey, it makes sense. Now what about the dependent clause? Well, the dependent clause contains at least a subject and a verb too. So what's the big difference? It's exactly like the independent clause. Wow, there's a huge difference. Just wait. First of all, the dependent clause is not a complete thought, nor is it a simple sentence, nor can it make sense all by itself. The dependent clause does not make sense all by itself. Please remember that. So, how do we know when we have a dependent clause? Well, there are little things called subordinate conjunctions. What about subordinate conjunctions? You need to memorize them because that's the telltale sign as to when you know you're working with a dependent clause. So let's practice.
After, although, as, because, before, if, since, though, unless, until, when, whenever, where, wherever, while.
Those are your subordinate conjunctions. After, although, as, because, before, if, since, though, unless, until, when, whenever, where, wherever, while. You need to be able to say that just rolling off your tongue so that way you never have to think about it when you're looking for a dependent clause. Now, let's practice an independent clause versus the dependent clause. Let's take a look at our first clause. We have, you were sleeping happily in your bed. Well, that makes complete sense because you have the subject, you, your verb phrase, were sleeping, and the rest of the sentence, happily in your bed. That makes complete sense. It's a complete thought. Very good. Now let's look at a dependent clause. Just by adding a subordinate conjunction, while, we have turned this into a dependent clause. While you were sleeping happily in your bed. Uh-oh. Well, what happened while you were sleeping happily in your bed? What happened? Tell me more. It's not a complete thought. It's keeping you waiting. You're dying to know. Well, notice, I have to add an independent clause after the dependent clause for it to make sense. Let's see what happened while you were sleeping happily in your bed. Comma, I put your hand in warm water. That's messed up. Now, look at this. While starts the sentence with a subordinate conjunction. Therefore, you know you need a comma that I highlighted in yellow, a comma before you introduce your independent clause. Let's take a look at another one. I hear your beautiful voice. That's an independent clause because I have a subject, I, and I have the verb here. And it's a complete thought. It's a simple sentence. Everything's cool. Good job. Now let's take a look and see if we can turn this into a dependent clause. What do we need to do to add to make it a dependent clause? Good job. You remember a subordinate conjunction. We added the subordinate conjunction when. When I hear your beautiful voice, comma. Well, it's not a complete thought. Please tell me what happens when you hear my beautiful voice. See how it leaves you hanging in suspense because they have not completed their thought yet? Well, let's complete that thought by adding an independent clause. When I hear your beautiful voice, comma, now here's the independent clause. My heart begins to melt. There! Now we have a complete thought. A dependent clause needs an independent clause to be a complete sentence. So, if you want more practice with this, go ahead and ask Mr. Palmer. Look up some resources on the internet. Do whatever it takes to master the independent clause and the dependent clause because it will help your writing.